Can I ask everyone to please find a seat? Can everyone please find a seat? We'll begin in just a moment. Good evening and welcome to our program this evening and to the Jack M. Templeton Liberty Series. My name is John Miko. I'm the Executive Director of the Foundations of the Union League, the three nonprofit charities based here at the Union League of Philadelphia. Before we begin, as always, a few housekeeping items. First, please silence your cell phones, or better yet, turn them off. And I'll give you all a moment to do that. Our program tonight will include a Q&A that will be taken from the cards that should be at all of your seats. So please feel free to write questions during the program. We'll collect them, staff will collect them during the program. Just pass them down to the end of the aisle, and we'll collect them during the course of the talk by our speaker, Mr. Goldberg. Also, remember, questions. Questions should be 3, maybe 4 sentences, and if you can't put a question mark at the end of that 4th sentence, you have failed. So even if you put a whole thing and it goes back to the other side, we're not going to read that question, okay? There will be books that Jonah will be happy to sign afterwards, so please go back afterwards and get a book signed by Jonah. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And I know that many of our Union League members have made reservations down at 1862 or Old Cafe. Congratulations, you're the lucky ones. There are no reservations left, but feel free. I'm sure they'd be happy to you could get a drink and maybe wait to the second seating later this evening. But really, there are no more reservations in our restaurants. So the Abraham Lincoln Foundation is one of these three charities at the Union League. We use the spirit, the collections, the history of this great institution for programs of all different types that speak to that history and that spirit and our values. Just want to bring your attention to a few of them. In your program, of course, is the rest of the Jack Templeton Liberty Series program. It's really a wonderful year, and we're delighted that you're all here tonight. Please come to the rest of them, January, February, and March. We have around the League House, one of the things we do are exhibits, and you'll see around the League House World War I exhibits. And we are celebrating and commemorating the service that Union League members made during that time. So if you see them around the League House, they are the product of the Abraham Lincoln Foundation. I want to give a shout out to the Vice President for Foundations and Library, Ed Trzanski, who did a wonderful program, led in a wonderful program last Sunday on November 11th to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ending of World War I. Thank you, Ed. And our newest exhibit just opened last month, Carved in Stone, American Monuments, Myth, and Memory. It's a look at American monuments, a focus on Confederate and Civil War monuments. I think you'll find it of interest, and please come down to the Heritage Center to see that. And finally, all that we do is made possible through the generosity of our members and others that give voluntarily to what we do at the Abraham Lincoln Foundation. So if you're not yet a donor, I hope you will be. You should receive something in the mail this week, probably, and I hope you'll respond and help us to continue the great work of our foundation. And if you want to be a leadership donor, please just see John Serlin, and you can join our founder circle and the many that support us at a leadership level. And with that, it's my honor and privilege to introduce the chair of the Abraham Lincoln Foundation, Joan Carter. Joan.
So good evening. It is my pleasure tonight to welcome one of the newest partners of the Abraham Lincoln Foundation, the Liberty Series, which is the National Review and the National Review Institute. This year's series includes two fellows from the Institute, Andy McCarthy, who will be here in January, and tonight's speaker, Jonah Goldberg. The National Review was founded by William F. Buckley in 1991, and the idea was to promote the ideals of a free society, ideals that Buckley advocated throughout his life. The National Review is now a leading voice of the American conservative movement, and its primary educational arm is the National Review Institute. The Institute engages leaders in business, philanthropy, and the media to advance the principles that Buckley espoused. And those principles are very much in line with the principles of the Union League. Like the National Review Institute, our own Abraham Lincoln Foundation was formed to promote the spirit and the history of the Union League as expressed in our bylaws. And all of you have heard me talk, you can probably say this by heart. Every member shall support the Constitution of the United States and the free enterprise system. So to tell you more about the National Review Institute and about a program that will occur here at the Union League over the next few months is the chair of the National Review Institute, Lindsay Craig.
So in one of these wonderful episodes of the vast right-wing conspiracy is really not that vast, Joan and I realized this evening that we have many mutual friends, both from New York and from Philadelphia, who I actually think we have actually been at some of the same very small gatherings at Andrea and Howie Rich's home, who are dear friends of mine and yours. So Thank you for such a great welcome. And we are so happy to be here at the Union League. Wow, you guys have such an amazing historical building. Thank you for taking care of it and actually hosting wonderful forums like this in the building that was intended to host forums like this. It's great. As Joan said, I'm president of National Review Institute, which is the nonprofit that supports the National Review mission. A lot of people ask, what is this? It's so confusing. It's not. Just think about it like this. Bill Buckley founded the conservative movement when he started National Review. And then in 1991, well, actually, let me say this. So National Review was founded, and he had a prospectus where he said, in 3 years, National Review magazine will be profitable. And in 3 years, he sent out his first fundraising letter. We know how this goes. The media industry did not become more lucrative. It became more difficult over time, and Buckley felt like it was very important that we support the highest profile writers that are associated with the magazine so they can have an impact on the conservative conversation. So in 1991, National Review Institute was founded, as Joan mentioned, and today we have a very specific message to promote the legacy of William F. Buckley Jr., to advance the conservative principles that he championed, and to complement the magazine in all of its efforts. The magazine, as you know, corporately, National Review, Inc., is actually a wholly owned subsidiary of the nonprofit Institute now. And we do that, we had a merger in 2015 so that we could continue to have an impact on the conservative movement for years to come. So what do we actually do, people ask. In addition to supporting National Review's top talent like Jonah Goldberg and Andy McCarthy, National Review Institute programs and events are strategically planned to bring this talent out to targeted regions around the country, and Philadelphia is one of those places. Our NRI on campus events bring Buckley's style of positive and engaging conservatism to college students who are painfully starved of this in their classes. And Philadelphia, as I said, is one of the 5 cities to host our 8-session course on the foundations of conservative thought. Jeff Webb, who's a member here at the club, an alumni of our New York program, founded our Philadelphia program last year, and we host our class here at the Union League Club. And applications will be open in December, so if anybody would like to apply, I suggest that you get in touch with Jeff. So NRI also hosts a variety of other programs around the country, debates, book signings, anniversary celebrations, just like tonight. We try to connect NRI supporters, National Review subscribers, and nationalreview.com readers with like-minded state and regional organizations like this one. We are on a mission, and we want you all to be part of it. So you're here to hear from Jonah, not from me. So Jonah, who always says he needs no introduction, this room was filled not because his bio was on the invitation, right? So how many of you follow him on Twitter? So just a note of his background, which I think is important. Jonah is also a senior editor at National Review, and importantly, he was the founding editor of NRO, which was the paradigm-shifting online platform for National Review. It was important then, it's very important today, and so we appreciate his leadership, and we don't want to forget it. So as we expand our enterprise, and we brought Jonah on as a National Review Institute Fellow, and we do things like support research for the book and then also promotion for the book so that we can bring him to people who are supporting and reading him all across the country. He's been crisscrossing the U.S., talking about his best-selling book, Suicide of the West, which you are all here to hear from him tonight. So I want to thank the Union League for hosting us this evening. I look forward to seeing you all again in January. Happy Thanksgiving and Merry Christmas.
So, yeah, wow, it's bright. Thank you for that introduction. I should say, just because, and those of you who heard me speak before know that this is actually true, I I always, when it's left out of my bio, I always like to point out that I'm also a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, but that's not the important part. The important part is that when the LA Times picked me up as a columnist, Barbra Streisand publicly canceled her subscription in protest. And all right, thank you all very much. Try the veal. No, this is really, it's great to be here. I've never been here before. I find these accommodations acceptable. And it's an absolutely amazing, it's a great crowd. The fake news will never report how big this crowd is. Turn that iPhone around, never. Yeah, so I want to get to the Q&A, and to be brutally honest, I am bone-weary, tired from crossing the country all over the place. So I'm not going to, as Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. I'm reminded of one of my, I think this is a friendly enough crowd, I can tell this sort of off-color joke. We'll find out in a minute. One of my favorite stories is about this medical school professor who wants to see if the students have done the assigned reading the night before. So he walks into one of these giant auditoriums and he looks at his seating chart and he says, "What organ of the human body, when properly stimulated, increases 8 times in size?" And then he looks at the chart and he picks out a very prim and proper young lady near the front and says, "Miss Jones." Miss Jones, she starts to blush. She starts to squirm. Professor, I just can't say. I couldn't possibly answer a question like that. And the professor says, "Okay." "Mr. Smith," and points to another student, and Mr. Smith says, "The pupil of the human eye when it goes from light to dark." And the professor says, "That is correct. Now, Miss Jones, I have 3 things to say to you. 1, you didn't do your homework. 2, you have a filthy mind. And 3, you are destined to live a life of unfulfilled expectations." So, that's sort of how I feel these days. When I first set out to write the book, I really wanted to come up with a sort of really clever shorthand for how to see the world kind of differently. I was somewhat inspired by, and I normally would give a long spiel about this, I wrote about it for the magazine recently, the movie They Live, which came out 30 years ago this year, and the star of it, Roddy Piper, was most famous for being a wrestler, but this was his real star turn. It was a John Carpenter science fiction movie, and the most famous thing about the movie, most famous line from the movie, is where Roddy Piper walks into a bank with a shotgun, and he says, "I've come here today to do 2 things, chew gum and kick ass, and I'm all out of gum." And I must have seen this movie, conservatively speaking, 4,000 times. And what I never knew was that, until very recently, around the time that he died, that it is in fact it is considered, literally considered, and when I say literally, I don't mean the way Joe Biden means literally, which is figuratively. It is literally considered one of the greatest Marxist films ever made. It is got a huge cult following among Frankfurt School Marxists. I'll give you just one example. Writing in Dissident Voice, which I know you all subscribe to. It's a radical newsletter in the struggle for peace and social justice. The communist writer Christos Gafalis dubs They Live the Marxist movie par excellence. He adds that it is, quote, "one of the most devastating and sharp criticisms of American imperialism ever made, representing in exemplary fashion the process of neoconservative barbarization in American society, as well as the dynamic of its revolutionary overthrow. Now, again, I saw this movie a lot, and all that went right past me. But as I rewatched it, they kind of had a point. If you haven't seen the movie, what happens is you have Roddy Piper is this sort of bourgeois everyman, this hardworking, down on his luck, blue-collar guy. He just wants to work hard and play by the rules and have his shot at the American dream. And then one day he puts on these weird sunglasses, and all of a sudden he sees that the world he thought he lived in is in fact a mirage. And he sees the real world that is revealed behind it. And so when he puts on the glasses, the colorized world that we know, this was a veiled shot, this is a fact, it was a veiled shot at Ted Turner, this whole bit. But when he puts, who was colorizing movies at the time, when he puts on the glasses, the world goes black and white. And when he looks at it, billboards of a beautiful woman in a bikini that says, you know, come to the Bahamas, he puts on the glasses and it says, marry and reproduce. And when he looks at magazine covers, it says, obey, conform, fall in line, don't question authority. And then when he puts on the glasses, sometimes when he sees very affluent rich people or successful people, it is revealed that they are in fact hideous ghoul-like aliens who are really running the planet. It's hard to explain what they look like, but sort of think like a really emaciated Henry Waxman, if you remember him. And so anyway, this is sort of what Frankfurt Marxism was about, was this idea that embedded in late-stage capitalism are these impulses to force people to conform, to fall in line, they take things that are luxuries and they turn them into necessities. They cultivate want and need and make you spin the sort of hamster wheel ever faster. And I actually have more sympathy for some of that than I used to, and we can talk about that later if you like. But all I really wanted was the glasses thing, and I couldn't really figure it out. And so I went with a much more cliched idea, which is basically just the visitor from another planet. Because what I wanted to show something slightly different. I didn't want to like reveal Frankfurt School Marxism to people. I wanted to reveal human nature. And what I mean by this is that I spend a lot of time day drinking, but that's not important right now. I spend a lot of time sort of daydreaming about sort of noodling, wool gathering, about things that if a visitor from 500 or 1,000 years ago, if they visited our society today, not what would seem different. That's really easy to imagine. Ooh, horseless carriages, flying planes, all that stuff. But what would seem recognizable? What would they say, oh, that's sort of how we did it? And I'll give you a quick example. North Korea. We tend to talk about North Korea as if it's this Stalinist, totalitarian, communist dictatorship. We use words like Marxist, Leninist to describe it and all the rest. And what people don't seem to realize for the most part is that North Korea itself got rid of its Marxism and its Leninism from its constitution and all of its official documents 30 years ago. They don't talk about Marxism anymore. They don't talk about communism anymore. They talk about things called juche and all this other stuff. It's not a Marxist dictatorship. It is a dictatorship, but it's not a Marxist dictatorship. It's a monarchy. If you read the official state propaganda of North Korea, the story of the three, Kims, right? They've gone from the divine right of kings to the divine right of Kims. And the story of the founder of North Korea, according to the official state doctrine that they teach in every single school, he was born on a mountaintop, and when he was born, night turned to day, and rainbows appeared, and all this kind of stuff. Kim Jong-un's dad, I don't know if you know this, but according to the North Koreans, of the top 18 symphonies ever composed, 18 of them were written by Kim. He also wrote something like 600 books in college. Again, it sounds like Dr. Evil from the Austin Powers movies, but he actually claims to have invented the hamburger. This is the father, this is the middle one. And he also claimed that his body was so efficient he didn't need to use the bathroom. Now, if you do a Google image search to look up the guy, it's not the body you would assume or associate with peak human efficiency, but that's a different issue. the point I'm trying to get at is that they've turned them into, literally, they've divinized them. They've turned them into demigods. This would be utterly recognizable in the age of Hammurabi. But beyond that, they have also created castes. They have a whole caste of essentially a slave caste. The people at the bottom of society, they are born into a caste they cannot get out of, and they have to spend their entire lives in slave labor. There are something like 53 different gradations of human beings in North Korea. It's almost impossible to move up. It's very easy if you do the wrong thing to move down. And so my point is that this form of social organization would have been recognizable to the Greeks. It's the kind of thing that Plato would talk about in the Republic. It is the kind of thing that defined most of human existence since the agricultural revolution in most societies. It is not modern, it's ancient and reactionary. There are other things like this. If you look at the way interest groups in Washington work and all that, it's very much like guild economics from the medieval period. One of my favorite examples of this is Mexican teachers' unions. In some states in Mexico, your teaching job is heritable, by which I mean if you teach chemistry, you can leave your chemistry teaching job to your idiot son or daughter because it's your property. It's like a title of nobility that is inherited. These kinds of things are far more prevalent around the world and in America itself than people realize. And the reason I bring this up is that's what I was trying to get at, is to show how human nature kind of asserts itself more than we realize. But I couldn't come up with the glasses thing, so I came up with this visitor from another planet thing. And so I begin fairly early on in the book with a sort of thought experiment. Imagine you're an alien from another planet, and you're charged with monitoring the progress of Homo sapiens ever since we split off from the Neanderthals, whether that was, let's say it was 250,000 years ago. It might have been longer. And you can only visit once every 10,000 years. Right? So 250,000 years ago, you show up in your spaceship, you got your little notebook, and you look down at the Homo sapiens, who at this point are basically all in Africa. And what do you write in your book? You write, semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. Come back in 10,000 years. Semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. No change. Come back in 10,000 years. Semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. Now, there are a few changes. Migration, different kinds of migration. We leave Africa, we go to Europe, we go to Asia, and all these kinds of things, and that means different dietary practices and all the rest, but we are still a migratory species. We are still foraging and fighting for food. One tribe fighting another. You would do this 23 times, writing semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. On your 24th time, you'd come to planet Earth and you'd see some amazing changes. You'd see the first city-states emerge because of the rise of the agricultural revolution. You'd see some really cool, like, spears, even some metalwork, some fetching clay pots. You would see the first aristocracies open up. You would see the emergence of this thing that prior to then was largely unprecedented in human history called the home, a place where people live year-round indoors. So you're like, oh man, I can't wait to see what happens on my next visit. So on your 25th visit, you come to Earth, and as you approach Earth, NORAD picks up your spaceship on radar, and you might get here just in time to see, I don't know, like Miley Cyrus twerking at the Super Bowl. So in essence, what I'm saying is that virtually all of the progress, all of the things that we associate with human progress have happened in the last 10,000 years. But that's misleading, because the truth, it's sort of like me saying the combined net worth of me and Jeff Bezos is more than $90 billion, right? It's true, but it's leaving something out, right? And alas, and if you buy more anyway, so that's because virtually all of the progress of the last 10,000 years actually happened in the last 300. You guys, a lot of you probably heard about that hockey stick that shows like global carbon emissions since, the last 10,000 years, and it goes like this after the Industrial Revolution, and Al Gore gets on his little crane and he points it out, and it's all great. Whatever you make of that, that's fine. But the vastly more important hockey stick is the one that shows, and it's in the back of my book, It's the one that shows that for 250,000 years, up until about 350 years ago, the average human being everywhere on the planet lived on no more than $3 a day. Ancient Rome, ancient China, South America, North America, Africa, Europe, doesn't matter. It's like this. Every now and then you get a little bump, and then the logic of Malthusianism bites us in the ass, and we regress back down to the mean. So for 250,000 years, 7,500 generations, the average human being everywhere lived in grinding poverty. That is our natural environment. The natural environment of humanity is a short and nasty life of grinding poverty punctuated by an early death, usually from violence or some bowel-stewing disease. And it's like this up until about 300 years ago, when once, and only once, in all of human history, does it lastingly and significantly change. In one place at one time, England. And it starts to go like this. And it's been going like this ever since. Now, I should point out, because there's still some Pennsylvania Dutch around, even though I guess they're all Germans, but whatever. There are people who say it also happened in Holland, or that it really happened in Holland, and if there are any Dutch jingoists in the room, I'm happy to have that argument. But my argument is that it happens in England, and it goes like this. And it's been going like this ever since. Right in this moment, we live in the greatest moment of poverty alleviation in all of human history. Hundreds of millions of people are being pulled out of poverty around the world. The UN might get rid of the designation called extreme poverty in the next 10 or 15 years because we'll have eliminated it. And the UN isn't responsible. Look, I'm all in favor. You know, the UN does some good things. It does a lot, and it does some crappy things. In full disclosure, my wife works for Nikki Haley at the UN, so take that for what you will. But what changed it were ideas. What changed it were this weird thing that emerges 300 years ago, what I call the Lockean Revolution. It is named after John Locke, but it's not because John Locke created it. Right? I want to be very clear about this. I could have called it the Smithian Revolution. I could have called it the Humean Revolution, whatever. I call it the Lockean Revolution because I think it makes the most sense. That doesn't mean I don't like John Locke. What has two thumbs and likes John Locke? This guy. But the point is, he represents this fundamental change in the way people thought about themselves in the world. And I call it the Lockean Revolution, and it's basically a bunch of ideas that mean things like, our rights come from God, not from government. We are citizens, not subjects. The fruits of our labors belong to us, which means that innovation is a good thing. For most of human innovation, which drives almost all economic productivity, innovation was seen as a threat to the established order, and it was crushed almost anywhere where it was given flour, in China, in the Arab world, in Europe. In Western Europe, innovation was literally a sin, the sin of curitas, questioning the established order. But then for some reason, because of the Lockean Revolution, it's that genie is let out of the bag. Out of the bag. Do genies come from bags? Out of the bottle. And the rest, as they say, is history. And people start getting richer. More and more people. It starts spreading out. It comes to America. It spreads out through Western Europe. And so, there are some conclusions that come from this that some people don't like. The first is capitalism is unnatural. Democracy is unnatural. Human rights are unnatural. If they were natural, they would have appeared a little earlier in the evolutionary record. Right? They emerge through trial and error over millennia. And we hit some sort of critical mass tipping point in England, and boom, we are pulled out of we go through the Narnian wardrobe, and we go into a different world, and it starts spreading. Now, I don't think it was invented overnight by John Locke or anybody in the 1600s. It took a long time to get there, right? I call this thing the miracle, and there are a lot of people who say, well, doesn't it come from Christianity? Doesn't it come from Judaism? And my short answer is, yeah, It does, right? I mean, if you want, I can go full Jeremy Corbyn on you and start in on the Jews. But my point is that these ideas that come out of Christianity, that come out of Judaism, which are hugely important, it still takes a couple thousand years for them to have the right material circumstances about 300 years ago to create this miracle. And we are pulled out into a different world. Where does the miracle come from? I don't know. Right? There's sort of a chicken or the egg problem with the Lockean Revolution story. Where does the Lockean Revolution story come from? Well, it comes from someplace else. All of the theories about where the miracle come from are interesting. I think there's merit to the Marxist ones. I think there's merit to the Protestant work ethic one. I think there's merit to the scientific revolution one. Deirdre McCloskey does a wonderful job disproving all of them to one extent or another. But I don't really care about that. The reason I call it a miracle is not because I think God gave it to us, though I have no problem with that argument. The reason I call it a miracle is because we don't know. We literally don't know. There's all sorts of consensus about this poverty thing. Marxist historians, Marxist economists, anarcho-capitalists, they all agree on that story. Little technical arguments, but they all agree on the math. The story about why this happened, there's no consensus. And so one of the reasons why we call things miracles is that when something really awesome happens to you, but you can't explain it, we sometimes call those things miracles. And so a big part of the argument in my book is that we don't appreciate the miracle. We do not have gratitude for the miracle. One of the great problems we have in this country and in the West in general is that we do not teach gratitude. We teach the opposite of gratitude, which is entitlement and resentment. We teach people to take what they have for granted and to actually feel like the world owes them something more. And I'll get back to more of that in a minute. So one of the things I did on when I was working on the book is I went and I read the original versions of the story of the goose that lays the golden egg. One comes in through France in the 1400s. I mean, it goes back to Aesop and all that, but one comes into France, appears in France in the 1400s, the other in England in the 1500s, and there are two versions. In one version, you have this couple, these cottagers, who, when a goose waddles into their life and starts squeezing out, I haven't done how much it was in, $15, $20, but a golden egg was pretty valuable, right? Giving them one golden egg a day. And they conclude, using their reason, their sort of Paul Krugman-like technocratic, omniscient reason, that if they're getting one golden egg a day, there must be a giant lump of gold inside. And so they cut it open and kill it, and there's no gold, right? In the other version, this farmer guy, goose walks into his life, gives him a golden egg every single day. And the guy says to him, I want 2 golden eggs. And the goose politely, like really politely says, I'm really sorry, but I just can't. I can only give you 1 egg a day. And the guy gets furious and kills it. The moral of these stories is supposed to be about greed, and that's fine if you want to say that's about greed. Greed's certainly part of it. But it's also about ingratitude. Right? It is this idea, the sort of Paul Krugman-like technocratic progressive vision says, I am smarter than the goose. I'm smarter than the market. I can outthink it, and if you just give me the power and let me do what I need to do, I can deliver better than what we've got. The other version is sort of this populist version, which you hear different versions of on the left and the right, which says, yeah, it's fine that things are better, but they're not better enough for me. I'm angry about it. You owe me. Gimme, gimme, gimme. Let's tear everything down because, we'll dance on the rubble. And these two forms of ingratitude, I think, inform or symbolize in a lot of ways so many of the problems that we have in our politics and our society these days. So anyway, back to my story. If all of these things are unnatural, and I think I can make the case that they are, then that means that all of the things that we associate with civilization require work. They require effort, right? If you take a jar of ants and you go to some planet or island or continent or whatever that has no ants, and you dump the ants out on the ground, the ants will immediately start doing ant stuff, right? And they'll dig tunnels, anoint a queen. I don't know what ants do, but they'll do it, right? They'll follow their nature. If you could take human beings and dump them out on some land where they were stripped of their civilizational education, they were humans in the raw, what would they do? Well, they would not create, Uber, but for marijuana, right? They would not create apps for iPhones. They would make spears, and they would be semi-airless apes foraging and fighting for food. And the reason I bring this up is that part of my argument is about our concept of corruption. We talk about corruption as if it's about bribery or graft or Chicago voting or whatever, and that's all fine, and those are forms of corruption. But if you read the Bible, if you read the Oxford English Dictionary, if you read Chaucer and these kinds of things, corruption has a much richer meaning in the past. It means rot and decay, giving into nature, putrescence, right? The concept of ashes to ashes and dust to dust. That's that cycle of entropy, this idea that nature reclaims what is hers, that rust never sleeps, right? If you take an outhouse and a grandfather clock and you put them out in a field, the termites won't care that one is pretty. They will reclaim whatever they can. It's the second law of thermodynamics. And so my argument is that this is also true about human nature. The Roman poet Horace says that you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, but it will always come rushing back in. And so all of the things that we associate with civilization are mechanisms that we've invented, right? One of my favorite intellectuals, Hannah Arendt, has got this great line where she says, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. Anybody who's had kids knows that she's onto something there, right? Because kids come into this world with some fascinating factory-installed software. But they need updates, right? And that's what parents do. Parents model the kind of behavior, they set the kinds of expectations, they civilize these barbarians and turn them into human beings. This is why one of the oldest definitions of conservatism is just simply the idea that human nature has no history. If you took a baby from, New Rochelle, and you somehow could send it back 1,000 years to a Viking village and get it adopted, the baby would grow up to rape and pillage the English countryside. If you could take a Viking baby and send it to New Rochelle in 2018, it'd grow up to be an orthodontist, right? The human nature is the constant variable, is the non-variable, right? It is the constant. It's how we deal with it that changes. The Founding Fathers understood this, which is why they set up rules that took human nature into account. The French revolutionaries didn't, which is why they turned their country into an abattoir, right? But this concept of corruption is essential to most of literature. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I love apocalyptic, like zombie movies and Mad Max movies and all these kinds of things, because all it takes is 5 seconds for the veneer of civilization to disappear, for us to revert into bands of tribes, fighting each other and killing each other for food, because that's our natural programming. The story of Lord of the Flies. You take these kids, these pinnacles of Western civilization, these little British boarding school kids, you drop them on an island. 5 minutes later, they got spears and war paint, and they're chasing each other because there's no parental supervision. So the relevance of all of this is that when the institutions that civilize us, starting with the family, don't do their job, it makes it easier for human nature to kick in. It makes it harder to hold human nature at bay. You can talk to, I got all sorts of problems with teachers' unions, but one argument that I subscribe to entirely is that when teachers say, look, a lot of these problems start in the home. That just seems incandescently true to me. We've known that poorly civilized males go tribal for thousands of years. Greek philosophers talk about it. right? The Irish slums of Hell's Kitchen, the Crips and Bloods of the 1980s. When young men are not properly civilized, particularly without a father in the home, they start acting out their nature, which is to like protect turf and form little bands and care a lot about sort of stupid symbolic stuff about like what color you're wearing, or whose turf you're on, and all that kind of stuff. Prison gangs are almost self-forming institutions because they line up with what our basic programming is. And so one of the reasons why I think our politics are so bad is that civil society across the board is falling apart. And there are a lot of different reasons for it. There are reasons that the left is absolutely correct about, and there are reasons that the right is absolutely correct about. And I'm happy to talk about them, but starting with the family, the number of out-of-wedlock births is now worse for whites than it was for African Americans when Pat Moynihan first started calling it out. Our tendency, which Alexis de Tocqueville wrote so much about, to form associations and groups in civil society, is eroding at a breathtaking pace. There are only two institutions, according to national polls, that a majority of Americans have faith and trust in anymore. The military and small business. Everything else is underwater. Police are like on the bubble. Lawyers, doctors, engineers, educators, all of them have lost faith and trust. Clergy, churches, synagogues, all of them are underwater. And so when these institutions can't do the work that they once did, we do not lose our desire to belong in tribes, our desire to belong in little groups. That is the natural environment that we grew up in. And so one of the things that we do is we start looking to politics for that sense of tribal belonging. And part of the problem is that we start looking to national politics for that kind of tribal belonging. Some of you might remember the creepiest PowerPoint presentation ever presented in all of modern political history, the life of Julia. All right, so this was this thing that the 2012 Obama campaign came out with. Every panel featured this woman named Julia, and it tracked her for her entire life. And every panel began with the words, "under President Obama." And so, under President Obama, Julia gets into Head Start. Under President Obama, Julia gets a Pell loan. Under President Obama, Julia gets a small business loan. The creepiest sentence ever uttered in modern politics, to my knowledge, except for maybe the Access Hollywood tape, is which says, "Under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child." You know, it just makes me feel unsafe, right? And at the end of her life, Julia gets to work under President Obama in a community garden, right? She doesn't even get her own garden. And so, but that's the point, is that this was intended for people who do not have other sources of belonging and meaning. If you read it clearly, the life of Julia is about what a woman does when all of the institutions that used to help you plug into civil society are gone. She's got no parents to mention. She has a kid. We don't know who the father is. The kid disappears when he turns 18 and never comes back. There's no church. There are no friends. It's just Julia and the state. I attended the 2012 Democratic Convention for reasons probably having to do with original sin. And the very first words of the convention were, "The government is the one thing we all belong to." Now, for me, as a sort of, at the time, Tea Party-ish kind of guy, that makes me want to flip the safety on my rifle, right? But that's not what, I'm not the target audience, surprisingly, for the opening video of the Democratic Convention. And for millions of decent, hardworking fellow citizens and human beings, what they hear is, the government is the one thing we all belong to, that we can all be part of. And that message sells. There are other forms of tribalism out there that sell. One of the most popular ones these days is identity politics. Identity politics, as we understand it today, it's purported, because it talks about intersectionality and all of this nonsense, that We think of it as a modern phenomenon, but this is sort of like the North Korea thing. It is an ancient form of human organization. We have this thing called the coalition instinct, where we look for reasons to find people with similar interests, and we band together to protect our interests. We are hardwired with this. It exists in every society that has ever existed. There's never been a society where we haven't given favors to friends and family and offspring. And civilizations have, from the beginning, tried to regulate this. We get the word nepotism from the Catholic Church. It means nephewism, because you had, under the bad popes and others, you had these archbishops and cardinals and popes who were appointing their nephews all over the place and giving them powers and prerogatives. The Chinese had this problem, and so they did something the Turks also did with their janissaries, is they castrated their bureaucrats and made that, because they figured, oh, now they can't have kids. But it turns out that families would actually pick one kid for the bad job, and they had the same problem. It's very difficult to fight this tendency. So anyway, but identity politics is basically just another word for a kind of understanding of caste or aristocracy. We get the understanding of we get the word aristocracy. It originally means just rule of the best people, the most qualified. But what happens very early on is that the aristocrats want to pass on their privilege and their rank and their property to their children. So they invent this idea of noble blood, right? That some people are just simply born noble and superior, or as Aristotle says, and some people are just born slaves by nature. It's very much like what they have in North Korea today. And this is what almost every society had for most of the last 10,000 years all around the world. And so what identity politics just simply says is that there are some people who, because of an accident of birth, are more worthy or more deserving than other people. It says we can look at whole categories of people as categories rather than as individuals. And it is very popular on the left, and it is increasingly popular on the right these days. And it breaks my heart. Because one of the truly great and glorious things about this country and about this guy is the story of how in America we're supposed to take people as we find them. So I originally wanted to title this book The Tribe of Liberty, because I wanted to make this argument that you need to civilize people within a custom and a culture that is more than merely rational. You can't talk to a barbarian baby and reason with it about why it should like liberal democratic capitalism, right? You have to make it a habit of the heart first. And my publisher didn't like Tribe of Liberty. No one understood what it meant. So after many negotiations, we went with Suicide of the West, because take a bath with a toaster was already taken. And no, but the reason why we set on, there are lots of different reasons for it, but one of the reasons why I didn't go was say death of the West, or decline of the West, or end of the West, is because I don't believe in those things. Suicide, no offense to people with mental health challenges and whatnot, but suicide's a choice. As my friend Charles Krauthammer said in a brilliant speech, decline is a choice. We are doing things that we know the right course, and we're choosing not to do them because they're hard and they make you sound judgy, right? But this is how the miracle unfolded. You can take the principles of our founding and trace them back to 4th century England. They start with these weird, and England was just weird, these quirky, weird things about England. Like in England, this idea that became the Fourth Amendment begins in the 4th or 8th century of England, that basically says you have to have the government has to have, basically the chieftain, has to have a good reason to come into your home. Your man's home is his castle. And this weird cultural thing gets more and more refined through the common law until it becomes an abstract principle that they hold dear. Then it comes to the United States and becomes even more abstract and is written down as the Fourth Amendment. Similarly, with, like, a good example of this is Locke's Notes on Toleration. When John Locke is writing his Notes on Toleration, or whatever it's called, Notes on Tolerance, I can't remember, he says all this great stuff about how, we have to treat minority religions with respect, and that we can't have a monopoly on virtue and on conscience and all this kind of stuff. But he's talking about the Protestant, radical sort of Calvinist types. He says, but not the Catholics, right? He's like, those guys, can't trust them at all. They can't have any rights. But this basic logic unfolding comes to America. Jefferson takes it and he refines it. And in his notes on toleration in Virginia, he says not only do Catholics should have rights, but Hindus and Jews and atheists and pagans should have rights too. Because it's this unfolding logic of this story about what America is that comes across. When Abraham Lincoln, let me put it this way, when the Declaration of Independence was written, the beginning part, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. I don't want to be too unfair, but that was basically like Jefferson being tight on a deadline. It was boilerplate. I'm not saying he didn't necessarily believe it, but those sorts of ideas were all over the place at the time. The exciting part of the Declaration of Independence wasn't the beginning, it was the end, independence. It's not until Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg gives his address where he basically reinvents the story of America. He doesn't reinvent it, he purifies it, he crystallizes it, he advances it. And he says, 77 years ago, our forefathers came to this land based on a proposition that all men are created equal. And he basically says that's what America is about. And it took another 100 years for the Martin Luther King March on Washington, for Martin Luther King to come to Washington and say, when the Founding Fathers wrote the Declaration and the Constitution, they wrote a promissory note. That's his phrase for it. That all men are endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights, including black men. And so what he was doing there was he was appealing to white America, a phrase I hate. You know how many millions of white Americans' ancestors came to America, weren't considered white, but that's a different story. He was appealing to white America and appealing to the best version of the story white Americans told themselves about themselves. That's what a civilization is at the end of the day. It's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. Who are we in the world? What is our culture and our civilization about? And so he was appealing to those principles. It was laying down a huge guilt trip and appealing to our sense of hypocrisy. The Founding Fathers were enormous hypocrites. They had all that stuff, but women couldn't vote, non-landowners couldn't vote, we had slaves. I mean, these are big problems, right? Slavery was evil. I think that's kind of settled. But it was also profoundly hypocritical. But the great and glorious thing about hypocrisy is you cannot be hypocritical without principles. It's only by falling short of your principles that you can be a hypocrite. If all you do is sit around on your couch playing Call of Duty and drinking malt liquor, very difficult for you to be a hypocrite about anything as long as you say all those things are good, right? And that hypocrisy has been the unfolding of the American story. And what breaks my heart today is that it used to be all of the debates about our ideals were about where to draw lines or how to live up to them. Whether it's free speech or anything else, right? On college campuses, the debate always used to be, where do we draw the line on free speech? Now the argument is that free speech itself is a tool of the patriarchy or white men or the pale penis people or whatever we're supposed to call them now, and that is inherently illegitimate. The idea that you're supposed to take people as you find them, that you're supposed to judge people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, that is now considered racist. We have taken those principles and we've basically said they're evil, rather than condemning the evil of us for not being able to live up to them. That is a suicidal choice. And we are making it in lots of different ways across the spectrum. And so I'm going to close because I don't know if you could tell, I've just been freewheeling here. And just read one thing. The second best thing ever written or said about the Declaration of Independence after the Gettysburg Address was by Calvin Coolidge, praise be upon him. And on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration signing, he said, About the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we have new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, towards the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern than those of the their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers. There are a lot of really good arguments about public policy and where to go and all the rest, right? But at the end of the day, when it comes to those ideas, Francis Fukuyama was right. We reached the end of history. We are at the top of the mountain. And when you're at the top of the mountain, it's all good and fine to argue about whether or not we should go left towards socialism or right towards nationalism. But at the end of the day, when you're at the mountaintop, whether you're talking about going left or right, what you're really talking about is going down. And that's where we are today, is that people are giving up because of a lack of gratitude for what we have. And I believe that conservatism boiled down is gratitude. You look around the world, you look around the society you live in, and you look at those things that are lovely and lovable and worth preserving that you want to leave to your children, and you conserve them. You maintain them. You put in the work of holding nature at bay for one more generation. As Ronald Reagan, also praise upon him, like to say, we are never more than one generation away from tyranny because we are not born with liberty in our blood. We have to fight for it every generation. And so I ask everybody here, in the presence of this guy, to stay in that fight, because it's a good fight. It's the only fight. And you're always going to be outnumbered in it, because people, because of human nature, are always going to look at politics to be something that it's not. And it's your job to tell them that they're wrong, and maybe do it with a smile. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jonah. Thank you. We have a lot of questions. We're not going to get to a lot of them, but let me try a few. Is it too late for civil discourse in American politics, or did it ever exist? And if it did, what can we do to bring it back?
Again, I don't believe in the concept of too late. I really don't. One of the arguments that I find persuasive about where the miracle comes from is that it just came from words, right? From the way we talk about ourselves changed, and that changed everything. And Deirdre McCloskey makes a great case for that. The problem with her argument is that she doesn't acknowledge enough, I think, that what can be created by words can be destroyed by words. But the way we talk can change. It's happened before, it can happen again. It takes leadership. It also takes some reform of the way our institutions work. It is absolutely true that we've had contentious partisan times in the past, and civility is always rosier in the rearview mirror than it was in reality. What is, I would argue, different about now is that we are following politics like it's a form of entertainment. And weird things happen to your brain when you follow things like entertainment. In a movie, if your hero does something horrible, and you like them, it doesn't matter. I like Harrison Ford, I like Denzel Washington, So he can kill people, he can shoot people, he can stab people, he can torture people. He's the good guy. And they actually do these great studies where they monitor people's brains. They'll take a guy in to a room, they'll open up a two-way mirror, and they'll show a guy strapped to electrodes, and they'll zap him. And the observer, the person watching it, will jump, right? Empathetic response, because they can imagine it being themselves. So like when you see something terrible in a movie, sometimes you'll just do one of those. They will then tell the guy who, let's say he's an Eagles fan, that the guy being electrocuted is a Patriots fan. And they zap him again. All of a sudden, the pleasure center of his brain lights up. And so when we follow politics like entertainment, when we retreat from real communities and get on things like Facebook and follow it where the other is an abstraction, it makes it a lot easier to forgive horrible things that your side does and a lot harder to forgive the horrible things that the other side does. And so I think that one of my policy goals is to send as much power down to the most local level possible, also to burn Facebook to the ground, but that's a different story. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard.
So here's kind of on that same vein. How specifically has media exacerbated tribalism, and what should we do to change it?
Right. So stipulate to my last answer, all that stuff. What I would add is, part of the problem is with this balkanization of the media environment, there are no institutions in the media that have anything like the moral or political or just basic authority that even the New York Times or CBS News had 40, 50 years ago. There's no one who's broadcasting anymore. This is true of movies and television. It's also true of news. Everyone is narrowcasting. The business model now is to get a sticky 2 or 3% that stays with you. You know the spinning logo on Fox News that just has Fox News and it goes around like this in the lower right-hand corner? You know why it spins? Because for the first 10 years it was a stationary logo and it ruined millions of TVs because it burnt into the picture tube the Fox logo that it would show up even when you were watching the Super Bowl on a different channel. And so it spins to save your picture tubes. They want sticky viewers. And the problem with that is that when you are catering to an audience that narrow, not always consciously, but you end up moving away from telling your audiences what they need to hear and moving towards telling them what they want to hear. And some executives in the mainstream media are honest about that. The guy who's the head of CNN recently admitted, yeah, we do too much negative Trump obsession stuff, but every time we change the subject, we lose viewers. People want to mainline that stuff. Same thing on Fox, but from the other perspective. So that is a big, big problem. We also live in this moment of what the political scientists call negative polarization. Under negative polarization, it explains why there are literally millions of Americans who say they're Republicans solely because they hate, or primarily because they hate Democrats. And there are millions of Democrats who say that they're Democrats primarily because they hate Republicans. My wife got a great drawing from my favorite cartoon from the New Yorker blown up for me for my birthday a few years ago and framed, and it has two dogs drinking cocktails at a bar in New York in suits, and one dog says to the other, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail. And in a market environment like that, there's an enormous incentive to fuel those instincts on both sides. And so I think TV is largely part of the problem now. And I say this as a Fox News contributor for 10 years going. And so I would like to see actually some more cord cutting in this regard, even though this is a declaration against interest. But if you're going to be a big news consumer, have a varied diet, right? If you read National Review, great. If you subscribe, even better. But also maybe read The Atlantic, or something somewhat on the other side to proof test what we're saying. We think we can handle it, but it's also just good for you to understand that there are sincere people making arguments from a different perspective, and that doesn't mean they're evil. It just means, by my lights, they're often wrong.
With all the significant advances in human existence over the last 350 years, why are so many embracing socialism today?
Well, the short answer is for somebody else to give. No, part of the short answer is that if you look at the polling data, if you look at what the smart people who are writing in favor of socialism will admit, what most of the people who say they're in favor of socialism really mean is they don't like this. They don't like the status quo. They don't like the system that we're in. They think it's mean. They think it's unfair. They think it's inequitable. All of those sorts of things. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book the way I wrote it, because what I was trying to do was persuade liberals, leftists, moderates, secular people, however you want to put it, that of all the things they think that politics is for, that government is for, capitalism is better at fixing most of them. There's some that it's not better at. Capitalism creates inequality. It just simply does. In your natural environment, the difference in wealth between the head leader of your nomadic tribe and the poorest person in your nomadic tribe could be boiled down to who got 2 extra helpings of mastodon, right? I mean, they didn't have pockets, they didn't have clothes, they didn't have wealth. There was remarkable income equality in the evolutionary environment we grew up in. And so that's one of the reasons why, and there's enormous data on this, we are hardwired to really hate 2 kinds of people, or resent 2 kinds of people. People who are getting more than their fair share, or people who aren't doing their fair share of work. And these are represented in different kinds of political approaches. Makers versus takers, welfare queens, the 1%, the 99%. All of these have analogs in human nature. And socialism pings our sweet tooth about how we want to live in a sort of more tribal thing. This is what Calvin Coolidge was getting at when he was saying all of these other systems are reactionary. They are reactionary. Communism was just tribalism for one class. Fascism is tribalism for one country. Nazism is tribalism for one race. They are all different forms of this cult of unity that we are hardwired with. And so socialism seems like the cool way to talk about it these days. Nationalism is another cool way to talk about it. And one of the points I keep trying to make to some of my conservative friends is that as a historical matter, the differences between nationalism and socialism are very, very small. And so the basic problem with capitalism is that it is the greatest cooperative system ever created for maximizing human prosperity and health. It just doesn't feel like it. The greatest essay ever written in the history of libertarianism is by a guy named Leonard Read, who wrote an essay called I, Pencil, written from the perspective of the pencil. It begins like, I am an Eberhard in favor number 2 pencil. And the pencil goes on to say, my wood comes from Canada, my paint comes from Delaware, my rubber comes from Indonesia, my zinc comes from Zinkland, wherever zinc comes from. And he points out that nobody knows how to make a pencil. Pencil manufacturers do not know how to make pencils. They know how to put together the last 2% of the ingredients. The pencil points out that you have these people who speak different languages, worship different gods, have different systems and traditions and faiths and all these kinds of things. They are working seamlessly and cooperatively all around the world to produce a pencil that costs per unit less than a penny. Right? It is the best cooperative system ever created. But it's so good, it's like the old Ivory soap commercials, 99 and 44, 100% pure. You just don't feel it because it's so good, it's so pure at cooperation. And so people have an innate desire to crave that kind of social solidarity and cooperation. And they look to politics to provide it. And the problem is that instinct is fine. That instinct is healthy. It's part of the glorious things about most religious traditions is this idea of being part of a community, communion. But what you need are healthy outlets and institutions to channel that instinct productively. Because when they don't, we don't lose that desire, and we look to unhealthy sources to satisfy it. I would argue socialism is one of those sources. Nationalism is another one of those sources. And as is identity politics. In fact, everything in the subtitle of my book is one of those sources. And part of the problem is that conservatives, still too many conservatives, want to scream Venezuela, North Korea, East Germany, Soviet Union in arguing with socialists. And the kids who say they're socialists have no understanding or memory of any of that kind of stuff, and they think of Denmark, Sweden, Canada, whatever, Narnia. And they're wrong about those places, because Sweden's far more free market than they realize, so is Denmark. But they're fantasizing, and the fantasy is very appealing, and we need to learn how to talk about it.
Jonah Goldberg, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Jonah Goldberg. Jonah will be happy to sign some books in the back. So if you want to say a few words to him and purchase one of his wonderful book, Suicide of the West, he'll be back there. January 15th is our next Liberty Series, Andy McCarthy, and all the students, and I'm not sure how we're going to do this. I think the students are going to go in the back or the front, Kira? Front. All the students in the front. We'll get a picture with Mr. Goldberg. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.